When World War II began, the U.S. declared neutrality because of their current economic situation. The U.S. later became involved due to attacks on their home naval base. The U.S. worked with the Allied powers to help end World War II.
The Neutrality Acts were passed in the 1930s after the U.S.'s costly involvement in World War I.
First Neutrality Act was signed on August 31st, 1935, and blocked the production and trade of all war materials.
The Neutrality Act also stated any U.S. citizen who traveled on warring ships traveled at their own risk. The act was to expire after 6 months.
After the Neutrality Act of 1935 expired, another Neutrality Act was passed in February of 1936 to renew the previous act for another 14 months. The renewal of the act also forbade any loans or credits to be made out to any countries involved in the war.
The Neutrality Act of 1937, passed in May, prohibited U.S. ships from transporting passengers or items involved in the war. U.S. citizens were also prohibited from traveling on these ships with such people or items.
Along with the Neutrality Act came the cash and carry provision, which was added by Roosevelt's advisor Bernard Baruch. Cash and carry provision made so the president could permit the sale and trade to belligerents of war as long as the recipients paid for the materials immediately in cash and provided their own transportation for the products. The cash and carry provision was set to expire after 2 years.
When the cash and carry provision ended, Roosevelt lobbied Congress to have the provision renewed. His attempt to get the provision renewed was rejected, and the provision lapsed. On November 4, 1939, the next Neutrality Act was passed, allowing for the trade of war materials to Great Britain and France, as long as they obliged to the cash and carry provision. Passed in May of 1941, the Lend-Lease Act was the beginning of the United States becoming more involved in the war without overextending in battle.
The Lend-Lease Act allowed the U.S. to provide Great Britain with war supplies while not actually putting any U.S. citizens in harm's way.
The U.S. became involved in World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japan on December 7, 1941. From this attack, 2,400 were killed with over 1,100 injured. Japan regarded the airstrike successful and justified their attack because of America's economic standing prior to 1941, which put the country into debt.
Japan justified their attack also because the U.S. froze Japanese assets and banned the sale of oil to Japan.
On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066. The controversial policy demanded the removal of any Japanese Americans seeking residency in the U.S. at the time. All Japanese immigrants, regardless of their residential status, were placed into detention centers. On February 19, 1976, decades after the war had ended, the current president, Gerald Ford, signed an order prohibiting Japanese Americans to be treated in such a way. In 1988, Ronald Reagan issued an apology on behalf of the government and authorized reparations for former Japanese citizens or their descendants.
Roosevelt did this because he felt it was his responsibility to oppose Hitler's Germany and their Axis partner, Japan, to end their quest for world domination.
On December 21, 1941, Roosevelt called his armed forces commanders to the White House to demand a raid on bombing Japan.
The war heightened racist attitudes and anti-Japanese sentiment grew. Many suspected their Japanese American neighbors might be spies or saboteurs. The military pressured President Roosevelt to take action. On February 19, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which made it legal to relocate Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were taken from their homes, some of which were seized by white Americans. They could only bring with them what they could carry, and were shipped to remote relocation centers. Once at the camps, they essentially became prisoners. Nearly 2/3 of people interned were native-born American citizens. Over 1,000 young people from the camps volunteered for military service. Eleanor Roosevelt strongly opposed the internment. She visited one of the camps and urged FDR to lift the order.
We must not forget this. We must realize that one cannot tell the difference between a citizen and a non-citizen by just looking at him, by seeing the color of his skin, or by hearing him talk.
Through all the controversy happening, Roosevelt still wanted to continue with his bomb raid on Japan.
Although the preparation for the raid took years, on August 6, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion wiped out 90% of the city and immediately killed 80,000 people. These would not be the only casualties, however. Tens of thousands of people would die later due to radiation poisoning.
3 days later, the U.S. would return with another atomic bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki, killing about 40,000 people. After these attacks, Japan's Emperor, Hirohito, announced his country's unconditional surrender on a radio announcement on August 15th.
The outcome for the U.S. resulted in the GI Bill and Victory Gardens. Passed on June 22, 1944, the GI Bill was created to help veterans of World War II. This bill helped establish hospitals, low-interest mortgages, and stipends for all veterans of World War II. From 1944 to 1949, nearly 9 million veterans received close to $4 billion from the bill's unemployment compensation program.
Victory Gardens, also known as War Gardens, were gardens planted to reduce the pressure on the public food supply brought on by the war effort.
On September 2, 1945, the Japanese delegation formally signed the Instrument of Surrender on board the USS Missouri, marking the official ending of World War II.